Hello, we are still here in the Ways and Means Committee. It is still Tuesday, April 21st. It is, lie and say it's 2:45, but it's really 2:50. And we are joined today by Phineas from the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center to tell us about some of the lessons to Vermont of Massachusetts passage of a millionaire's tax. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate you bringing in different viewpoints from other states as part of this process.
Yeah, happy to do it. So we are hearing from Cristobal Young right after you, who I'm sure you're familiar with, and so he's going to focus on tax flight, but would love to hear about your experiences, the conversations you all had in Massachusetts, how the revenues have sort of shaken out on the other side. Anything else you'd like to share with us? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, committee. I want to talk really briefly about sort of what the revenue experience has been, what the investment experience has been, and then some of our particular experience on the tax flight issue. And I think uh, what may be in common with our experience and the bill that was sent to me is that for Massachusetts, the so-called millionaire's tax was a bold piece of legislation. It wasn't a kind of a small incremental measure. It was breaking with 100 years of of you know or forbidden in our Constitution on having different tax levels for different income classes, and so was really a kind of break where people got very excited on both sides of the issue, and we definitely heard that the sky was going to fall on our heads if we did this, and it was a lot of very stark warnings about what would happen if we would go this route, and so it's been heartening to see that it's been such a really an unmitigated kind of success. And I can just share just a few slides on this, if I may.
That sounds great.
Okay. Um, so yeah, I've got it. Yeah. Uh, so this one here, oops, that's not where I want to start though. This one here is just the revenue here, and this is a a little complicated by the fact that there's both the budgeted revenue in the orange and the actual collections in blue, and we only have 2 years of actual collection data, full years of collection data. There was just a few months in our fiscal year 2023. Um, that's not really enough to be able to say much about. But the first full year in FY 2024, the legislature really heeding the stark warnings, budgeted only $1 billion in surtax money, fair share money, and instead we got $2.4 billion. So it was a real kind of big, I think, surprise to many. We had been assuming that some Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy (ITEP) projections would be correct, that were pretty much right on with that $2.4 billion. So we were less surprised than some were. But the next year, the legislature remained somewhat tepid or cautious and only budgeted $1.3 billion in this fair share money. And instead, we ended up with just over $3 billion in actual certified collections. Um, for your information, the more money that comes in, because this is a dedicated fund, then goes to a separate kind of reserve fund, which then gets spent out in a supplemental budget. So all this money has eventually gets budgeted and spent. But you can see from the projections from the legislative point of view, where the legislature now in 2026 is now budgeting $2.7 billion for it. So they're kind of learning, our legislator is learning that this is real money that really is going to be delivered and is dependable, and that it's not going to disappear because of tax flight or something of that sort. We don't know, we won't know for sure about FY26 collections for a while, but we do know the first two periods have been certified, and those don't include the April tax collections, so they're less than half typically, but we see them up 22% higher than 2025 was in the actual collections for those first two periods. So we have so far reason to believe that FY26 is going to be even more revenue than FY25 was. Um, and and you can see the legislature budgeting for FY27 that that 2.7 billion, still hedging their bets a little bit, trying to be cautious, but that the money is coming in. And I think it, the actual revenue is in some ways the greatest proof of the pudding for this, for the success of this in terms of retaining the revenue and not falling into pitfalls of tax flight. In just that, if the tax, we kept hearing that these tax filers were going to disappear, that they were just ready to disappear if this thing gets approved, and then when it was approved, that we'd better do all kinds of, other changes to keep these people because they're all ready to flee. And and really the proof is kind of in the pudding that they're sticking around because they're paying the checks. And you can really see that in terms of the investments. This graphic is from the governor's website that you can see in the lower left corner. They put together a website just highlighting the investments from this. And it doesn't include the most recent supplemental, but it really, if you walk through that website, you will get a real taste of the things that have been made possible by the fair share money, the millionaire's tax money in Massachusetts. And some of it is things that are very concrete for people. They know that their kids used to have to pay for lunch, or they used to have to pay to get on the bus, or they used to have to pay for community college, and now they don't. These kind of very concrete affordability measures, these very concrete improvements in their life. And other things are a little bit more background. There was a long-term plan to expand funding for K-12, which has only been able to follow through on because of this surtax money. Or there are cheaper bonding than the state would otherwise be able to have, because we're able to put some of this money into capital accounts. And some of these things are harder, I think, for people to appreciate, but the investments from this millionaire's tax have been, really quite dramatic. And I think that education, again, ours is dedicated to education and transportation, and those communities feel like it has been a really good time. We're still worried about federal cuts and such, but it has been a real time of just very concrete kinds of improvements. And the last thing I'll say, I know that Christabel Young will talk about this more, but just very specifically for our experience with retaining the tax base, we heard that we were going to see, for sale signs springing up everywhere in the most affluent communities, and that just, there's no even sort of half-hearted news attempts of that. We know from the census data that we've continued to see this sort of slow but steady overall population growth. The most recent IRS data, which is only gives you a little bit of the period since the millionaire's tax passed in November of 2022, but the net out migration overall in that period is less than it had been before the millionaire's tax had been passed in Massachusetts. And that from the IRS data, we know that of the people who are leaving Massachusetts, that 9 out of 10 of them have incomes under $200,000. So there's not a sort of this sudden spike in seeing high income people leaving. So in all those ways, we see a very positive experience from Massachusetts and passage of our ballot question. I'll stop sharing and look forward to whatever comments or questions you have, although I see that Professor Christabel Young is already here.
Well, that's okay. Representative Compton.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, the first is that Vermont is a very different state and it has a very different economy than Massachusetts. And would you encourage us to anticipate different effects or similar effects to what you see in Massachusetts? And especially given what we see nationally around concentration of opportunity and despair. But then in addition to that, are there certain investments that once made seem to make people stickier and to support retention of, particularly I think in Vermont, we're worried about our lower middle income families and keeping them here.
So I think my experience on this goes a lot from Professor Young's research, which says that the richer people are, the more likely they are to remain where they are. So from that point of view, I'd be less worried about the people in the 13.3% than potentially the people below that, but I don't really know. I do know from my time in Vermont that people feel a real deep attachment to Vermont, and I don't know how that plays in the face of tax and other opportunities. So I guess I would just say that I don't really know for some of those those sort of middle income classes. I do like the way you constructed it to retain that there isn't an incentive to file separately, as that was something that we had to contend with our tax, and you've already dealt with that.
Yeah, hi. Just a few questions for you. So what is the fiscal year in Massachusetts anyway? I'm not sure. What is year end?
So it starts July 1st.
Okay.
So
right.
it's, yeah.
Same as ours. So I'm just wondering, when you're looking at the IRS data and those the people that have moved out, are you looking back at 2024 returns then, or are you already looking at 2025 tax returns?
So the IRS data, unfortunately, the most recent migration data only talks about the transition between 2022 and 2023. So basically, anybody who filed in Massachusetts in 2022 and then filed in another state in 2023.
Yeah, so it doesn't have the full effect of the tax. So what is the flat? I can't remember what the rate of the flat tax is. It 5%?
It's 5%, and then the ballot question added an extra 4% on top of that. So it was, in that way, it was quite a dramatic change addition. Yours is well, yours has a series of increments, but ours is sort of everything is the same except for these, extreme incomes above $1 million.
Is it a straight million, or is it more than $1 million?
It started at a straight million, but it's inflation index, so that now it's a little bit over 1.1 million.
Okay. All right, great. And do you know of the people that are paying it, how many are paying it more than once, or are earning more than $1 million? Because in our own tax base, we've got very few that are earning more than $1 million every year. So it's they have a one-time event, or might sell a business or that type of thing in terms of their income. Do you have that insight into the taxpayers that way?
I don't. I know we looked into this question, that this had been brought up as, is there a phenomena of sort of one-time millionaires who are just cashing in on their nest egg or something like this, and sort of whom aren't the habitual millionaires. And again, this is a question which I'd say we relied on Professor Young's research quite heavily, and we're quite struck by with the real rich data he has uh, showing from this administrative actual returns of people, that those who tended to be millionaires also tended to be millionaires for most, or tended to have at least very close to $1 million incomes for both the years before and the year after. It was much more rare a phenomena of a what kind of one-time millionaire than we thought when we were first looking at that data.
Okay, and then the last question I have for you is in terms of the dedicated fund, it looked like from your slide, and I can go on your website, haven't done it yet, in terms of the use of the money. So it's not that it was passed to take place of other revenue streams or faltering revenue streams. If these are additional revenues to pay for one-time expenses or operating expenses, how is that working?
So it's a little more complicated. So it's for transportation and education, and it's been pretty easy to show that all of that money has in fact gone to transportation and education. The budgeted money can be either for one time or ongoing operating, but then when they underestimate, at which they have quite a lot because they've been surprised how successful it's been, that money which gets put into a special kind of reserve fund, that is supposed to be spent only on one-time expenses. So that's the difference. I'd say they've been pretty liberal in defining what one time means, but it is
Yeah.
supposed to be spent just for one time.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. That's helpful. Yeah.
Real quick, it looks like this information came from you folks as well, but it shows here that there's a net loss of 4.2 billion in adjusted gross income between 22 and 23. And I'm just wondering what you attribute that to, and if there was more information on 24 to 25.
So that's the IRS data, and the 22 to 23 is the most recent. So I think what people were really looking to see, this is what's called net adjusted gross income in the migration data. And so what people were really looking to see was there going to be a spike in this AGI, this adjusted gross income out migration after the millionaire's tax. And it's actually the AGI in 22 to 23 is less than it had been 2 years ago, and pretty comparable to what it had been the year before. So there isn't a spike in it. The question is, what does it represent? And for Massachusetts, one of the things is Massachusetts, I'd say, unlike Vermont, is less of a place that people retire to. And it's a place that a lot of people retire away from. And so we tend to have a lot of net out migration where people will leave Massachusetts, especially for Florida. And this has been true since way before the millionaire's tax. And I think one of the things which complicates this is the AGI. This data is very explicitly not supposed to be taken as an indication of tax flight, because it means, for instance, if you have a surgeon who moves to Florida, their income is seen as having left to Florida, but in fact, some other surgeon is making that money. And if they move to Florida, but they keep their business in Massachusetts, Massachusetts continues to tax them for their company in Massachusetts. The only thing that happens is they file their tax return from Florida, which makes the AGI data make it seem as if their income is leaving Massachusetts, but from a revenue point of view, their income is not leaving Massachusetts, and isn't, for the workers that they pay. Same thing if they have a business in Massachusetts that they sell when they leave for Florida. the people who buy that business continue to operate it. So the AGI statistic is one that we really caution people not to see as symbolizing anything like tax flight. And there's been, people from the Tax Foundation and other organizations who have really cautioned against using it that way as well.
Thank you.
Teddy, do you have one? You sure? Okay. Anyone else?
Oh, yeah. So it was prohibited constitutionally. How did you pass it? I mean, if it's.
There were a lot of long signs right over the border from Brattleboro, I'll tell you.
Is it an amendment to the state constitution that enabled you to actually put it in place?
We had to change it was the fifth effort over 100 years, well, 106 years to change this thing which had been put in the 1916 state constitution. When they created the ballot process and created the income tax, and they decided against getting too wild and giving women the vote. They weren't going to go that far, but they put this restriction on their having different tax rates for different incomes, and that stayed for over 100 years.
Wow. So stay vigilant is what you're saying.
Well, it says that it takes a while to overcome. People get scared, and it's been, I think, very satisfying for people to see that this didn't have the kind of sky falling on your head results that we'd been told, and which had stopped it the previous 4 times.
What is your next step in Massachusetts? Are you focused on your strange property tax structure or continuing the income tax?
I think that's still to be decided. One of the things we're hoping is to decouple from some of the one big beautiful bill corporate tax cuts.
I
I don't have a question that just made me think of. So when you were doing the ballot question on this, was there anything on the ballot question around the Constitution for what this money would be spent on, or was that sort of like a separate messaging?
No, it was our whole ballot question was one paragraph, and it said that it'll be spent on public education and for transportation, and I think it specified. It said, such as roads and bridges and mass transit.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's good to see you, and hope to talk again soon.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be followed by such a great scholar as Professor Young here, whose work has been really, really influential for really anyone who looks at these questions. So thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Welcome. Ooh, you just went away. Where'd you go?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Hello.
Little monitors. Welcome to Ways and Means. Thank you so much for joining us. I think you were here 2 or 3 years ago, but we have a lot of new people around the table and a slightly new question on the table. And so really excited to hear from you about your work.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Let me just share my screen 1 second. I'm not quite seeing what ought to be shared. Where did y'all go? You'd think I knew what I was doing a little bit better than this. Here we go. Okay. Hopefully this is loading up.
Seems like it.
Okay.
There you go. Success.
Great. Okay. Well, yeah. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you my research on this topic. So millionaire taxes, state millionaire taxes, is something I've been studying for almost 20 years, using confidential tax returns from New Jersey, California, and ultimately IRS for the whole country. So I thought I would start today with New Jersey as being perhaps the most immediately relevant to Vermont as a small geographic state with low tax neighbors. So this was also the first study that I conducted with my colleague Charles Varner. We worked with the New Jersey Division of Tax Microdata. So we had data on every high income tax filer in the state, top earners who move, file a part year return in the year that they move. So migration is easy to observe in the New Jersey data. So this is what the tax reform looked like. There's our marginal tax rate schedule. It kicked in. They called it a millionaire's tax. I did, that was their language, not mine. But it kicked in at $500,000. And it raised the tax rate by 2.6 percentage points on everything you earn after 500,000. So, New Jersey's low tax neighbor is Pennsylvania. They have this flat 3% tax. That would be sort of down here. So already above Pennsylvania, and increased the gap to about 6 points. So this is how it affects your actual tax burden. So at 500,000, this is sort of key to understanding how we do the analysis. But at 500,000, it doesn't affect your taxes at all. It's only like the dollar after 500,000, and then it increases your effective tax rate, just how much your income you're paying in state income taxes. That increases slowly as we're getting up to a very high income. But this is the thing that we're going to look at. So the context here, New Jersey, mostly think of New Jersey as being part of the New York metro area. A lot of the population, the millionaire population, are in the metro area in northern New Jersey. So if you were in Bergen County, New Jersey, it's a very short move to, say, Fairfield County, Connecticut, which at that time had a top tax rate of 5%. And of course, Pennsylvania runs the whole border of New Jersey with that 3% rate. So, with a very short distance move, you could be in a tax regime that had much lower rates. And that led, folks like the governor, Chris Christie, say things like this. Now, this was a time there wasn't really much evidence on this question at all in existence, but the argument made a lot of intuitive sense to him. So this is what we're looking at here. Now, just to sort of lay the groundwork, this is the population of the New Jersey millionaires. That would be the folks making 500,000. Or more, and that population was growing strongly in the years after the new tax was passed. So now this growth here we see here, 35% increase since the year before, in like the first 3 years following the tax increase. This is not population change. These are people who were living in New Jersey the whole time, and there's just what was happening is that they were making more and more money. And so more of them their incomes were growing into the bracket where they would be affected by the tax. So this is the source of the strong growth of millionaires. It's not actually people moving into New Jersey. It's just a more prosperous New Jersey. And so, even if some of these folks are moving away, as the governor was expecting, overall, we're seeing a very strong growth in this tax base. Now, let's look at migration specifically. The net out migration. So people moving out minus the people moving in per thousand population. This is in the 3-4 years before the tax increase passed. So look at people who made 100,000 to 500,000. These folks never are subjected to the tax. It's above here. Now, interesting, we do already see that, this is the area where there's some net out migration, per 1,000 population. So these are small numbers, but this was the pre-existing pattern before the tax passed. And what happens, well, what we'd expect to see, the theoretical expectation, if the tax migration story holds true, we would see something like this, where, again, these folks aren't affected at all. And then these folks are slowly more and more affected. So we're sort of looking to see this kind of pattern. And here's what we actually see. So again, the bar shows where the tax kicked in. We see, and so essentially, just to be clear about this setup, we're using essentially the 95th to the 99th percentiles of the income distribution as a control group, as an untaxed control group for the people who were affected by the tax increase. And anyway, as you can see here, there is a period effect, and that there's a little bit more outmigration across the board, but we're not really seeing any unique effects, any unique difference appear for the group that was actually exposed to that tax increase. We don't see at all this pattern of sort of growing outmigration as their incomes rise above this tax threshold. So again, there's no, we're basically seeing a zero effect here. Again, we do see a period effect. What was that? Well, again, I think there had been a recession in 2001, just to jog everyone's memory a little bit. By 2004, the economy is growing strongly, and there's a housing market boom in New Jersey. So we can see this New Jersey compared to prices, especially in the years following the tax increase. There was a big increase in housing prices, and so maybe this is probably, as a guess, is sort of maybe driving why we see a bit more migration across the board, but nothing specifically attributable to the tax increase. Okay, so anyway, what did we just learn here? Growing millionaire population, even with some outmigration. Specific, from the graph, you would say basically there was a zero effect. A little bit more precisely mathematically, what we estimate is a tax flight loss of 1 millionaire per 2,000. 1 per 2,000 millionaires moving because of the tax increase. So very close to zero. And what we find in terms of revenue is it raised about $1 billion per year and led to a modest reduction in after-tax income inequality. One more thing I'll just briefly mention, Chris Christie the governor was very displeased with this research, and so he appointed his chief economist of this state to replicate our research. They had equal access to the New Jersey tax returns. And so these guys are called CLS, that's their acronym, but Charles Steindl and co-authored. Anyway, the point is they came back with estimates that were basically the same as ours. Some were even smaller, some were a tiny bit bigger, basically within our confidence interval. So it was replicated and they found the same results. So pretty high confidence research. I don't mean to rush through, happy to take questions about this, but that was the New Jersey case study. Of course, there's about 10 states now that have millionaire taxes, so we can look much more broadly than that one state. Of course, the main concern here is that there's these states that have no state income tax at all, that being, your neighbor, New Hampshire. I would point out Washington State actually just flipped columns. They were a zero income tax state, and then they just passed a millionaire tax starting next year.
They also have a constitution.
But what you care about is really New Hampshire and honestly Florida. So let's look at the whole country and just sort of dig into this question. How should we be thinking about high income earners? Are they mobile millionaires searching for low tax places to live? Or are they more like embedded elites that are reluctant to move away from places where they've been highly successful? So a series of technical articles on this over the years and a book written for a general audience. I'll sort of focus a bit more on the presentations that I developed for a broad audience just because, they're nice and easy to process. This article did come out just last year, and I have updates that I'm happy to talk about. So this research I'm going to show you now is done in collaboration with IRS and with co-authors inside IRS. We use data on this is everyone in the country who earned $1 million a year or more in any given year. It was pulled into our data set. So all states, all millionaires, this is over 12 years. So the original results, I guess I've got updates to 2023. So it gives us a sample of 45 million millionaires. That's 3.7 million unique millionaires who filed over 12 years. So 12 years of tax returns for all these folks. Also pulled a 1% sample of all filers just so that we can, at every income level, just so we can sort of ask, how different are the rich from, general population, from average folks? Okay, and we're just tracking migration as just people change the state from which they file their federal tax returns. So, the basic tax migration hypothesis breaks down into three simple questions. So I'll walk you through them one by one. The first question is just, where do millionaires live today? Do they live in low tax states? Do they tend to live in high tax states, or what? So this is a map showing millionaires per 1,000 population. The highest concentrations are sort of in the Northeast here, Connecticut being the highest, but also New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts being the top three. So this just sort of shows you the whole country view. I think it's maybe more interesting to compare this to the tax rates. So it's this graph here. I've got the, excuse me, effective state tax rates on top income earners. And then here's this sort of millionaires per 1,000 population. So as you can see, this is a very flat graph. There's no real relationship. If we really believed in the tax migration, tax flight story, what should this look like? Well, these zero tax states over here, presumably they should be much higher. This is what we'd expect to see, is sort of up higher on this side of the graph, showing that a lot of millionaires want to live in these low tax states, and that the millionaire population densities we would expect to see them declining as the tax rate increases. We don't see this at all. Very slight upward sloping, really basically essentially no relationship. So millionaires today live in high tax, low tax states in about equal proportions. And I would just point out that a lot of these tax differences are very long standing. So these low tax states, low income tax states, they've never had a state income tax. And places like New York and California have had relatively high tax states, have been relatively high tax rates on millionaires for almost 100 years, since the 1930s at least. So, relatively high taxes on the rich in New York are older than the Empire State Building. So just basic face validity of the tax flight story is not very strong. Okay, so
Just want to make
Yeah.
sure that no one has any thoughts, questions before we move on to the next.
Thank you.
Representative Maslin.
Yeah, I have a question. Remember if it was Representative Holcomb asked you, sir, or the current or the primary witness, but are there policies or things that can tend to make millionaires more sticky to Vermont? That would be something that a lot of people here would like to know if you have insight on that.
Yeah, I will definitely get to that. I have some, so I'm gonna speak to that point. I could jump ahead, but
No, we can wait until we get to it. That's great.
Yes, please take your time.
okay, thanks.
The second question's also gonna wait, so back to you, sir.
Okay, sure. Always happy to take some clarifying questions. But okay, so the second question in our 3-question series is, okay, well, how mobile are millionaires in practice, residentially? We know that they travel a lot, but do they move their residency very often? So this is just looking first. These are migration rates, just moving between states, moving across state lines by income. First, starting with the general population, what we just see is that migration is not something that you do because you have a lot of money or because you can afford to move. Migration rates decline with income, and the lowest income earners, these are people who I think for the most part are sort of struggling to find their economic place in the world, and they're much more mobile than higher income folks. So they're about 4.5% move across state lines each year compared to about 2% of like the upper middle class. And now when we add in millionaires here, specifically, we do see, like a grain of truth to the millionaire migration hypothesis. They are a little bit more mobile than the upper middle class, still much less mobile than low income folks. And look at here, this, I've actually compressed this. We're going from 100,000 up to 7 million. The last label here is 5 million dollars a year in annual income. These are by income the richest people in the world. And yeah, so their migration rates are a little bit higher than upper middle class, but it's actually a very modest effect. But again, like I say, a grain of truth to this story. But if you looked at this, it would not give you reason to think we should be really worried about taxing high income earners because they're so mobile. That's really not the story, even if there's a sprinkling in here. So millionaires overall, they move at a rate of about 2.4% per year. And that'll be a number that we'll come back to in a minute. Okay, so millionaires don't move very often, but when they do move, how much of these moves can we attribute to tax migration? Just moving across state lines per se doesn't indicate that it's tax flight. We need to specifically see people moving from high tax to low tax states. And that's going to be just our basic definition of tax migration. Do you get an actual tax cut from the move? So we're going to be thinking about, this map, which shows the top tax rates across state lines. So we want to see how much this data can explain the interstate migration patterns that we're actually seeing. Okay, so this is the stage where normally, and in the technical articles do break out a lot of sort of complex statistical analysis. Can be a lot to explain. When I wrote a book about this, I didn't want to put any sort of regression tables in the book. I didn't think anyone was going to read those. So I tried to figure out how can I simplify this, or how can I find a way to explain what these data are saying in really clear terms in a way that also captures the more technical analysis. And it turns out that indeed there is a way. There's a really simple way to understand this. So what we do here is take all millionaire movers, only looking at movers, only looking at people who made $1 million a year, moved across state lines. And we put every one of these folks into one of three bins. First, they move to a higher tax state. That means a higher tax state than what they were paying before. So if you move from Vermont to California, that would count as moving to a higher tax state, right? I get that, with the tax reform, that it would no longer count as that. But just to be clear, and the second bin is people move to the same tax state, and then people move to a lower tax state. And this is the part that looks like that we're going to count as tax migration. So this is what we're looking for, and here are the bins. So again, we take all movers, 1/3 of them move to states that charge them a higher tax rate, a meaningfully higher tax rate than the state that they were previously living in. So like I said, I've been doing this research for a long time. These individuals never become a news story. Nobody ever writes a news article that said, this person just moved to a high tax state because they wanted to pay more taxes. Those stories just don't get written. They don't make any sense, and so they don't get talked about. Okay, there's another 21% who move to states that effectively have identical tax rates, and so there's just no evident tax migration can be inferred here. The third is the area where we're looking to see tax-induced migration, and here again we do see some evidence of it. So 47% of all millionaires who move are moving to a state that charges them a lower tax rate than where they're coming from. So it's higher than this bar. If these two bars were the same height, it would be a wash, and it would just say that people move between states regardless of the tax rates. And in fact, what we are seeing here is excess, what you might call just excess migration to low tax states. And that's what basically shows tax motivation among movers. And this also, this number that we come up with here maps on exactly to the much more technical analyses as well. So what do we make of this? What it means is that 15% of all millionaire moves came with a net tax advantage. So 15% of millionaire movers, I conclude, are moving for tax purposes. So that's not 15% of millionaires, that's 15% of the millionaires who move. Okay, so coming back to that previous number, what we're looking at here is essentially a small fraction of a small fraction. So in any given year, migration rate is 2.4%, and 15% of those folks are moving for tax migration purposes. The other 85% of these moves don't seem to have any tax motivation. So this gets us down to a summary number of, about 0.3% of millionaires move for tax purposes. So, that's a very small proportion. There's still, there's still many anecdotes you could write about this. You could name a bunch of names. Remember, we start from this very large data set of all millionaires in the US over 12 years. We started from a data file of the tax returns of millionaires with 45 million tax returns from all American millionaires. Out of all that data, we got 165,000 cases of millionaire migration. And of those, 20,000 of them are tax motivated moves. So it's certainly enough to fill, an anecdote mill and keep, newspaper stories about, person X moving for tax advantage. And those cases are memorable and they make good news, they make readable news stories. But they're not representing what's really going on the ground very well. Okay, so the next part, just giving you a chance if you wanted to jump in, but so the next part I wanted to show you is again coming back to the geographic question that is presumably on your minds, with running this border with a zero tax state. So this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. So Oregon and Washington have been the best case of this because Oregon long been essentially one of the highest tax states in the country, 13% top marginal tax rate. Washington State not having an income tax at all. So anywhere along this border, very similar geographies. We've got the Columbia River here. If you lived on this blue side, the Oregon side of the Columbia River, if you flipped over to the Washington side, this would be a very small life change, a very commutable distance, and then you'd be in a completely different tax system. And, just to double down on this for a minute, this metropolitan area here we're talking about, we call it Portland, Oregon, but a large portion of the metro area is actually on the Washington side where it's called Vancouver, Washington. So even within a city, there's a low tax side of the city and a high tax side of the city. And so we can think about this border as sort of being an interesting place. If people are really motivated to be in a low tax system, why would they ever live on the low tax side of this border? Why not all concentrate on sorry, I said that backwards. Oregon being the high tax side of this border, why would anyone live on the high tax? I keep trying to say it. Why would anyone live on the high tax side, the Oregon side, when the Washington side offers more attractive tax rates, zero specifically? Okay, so this is actually a reality at the borders of virtually every state in the US. And you can see, Vermont, New Hampshire up here as being another good example of this. So I look at what we're doing here is just looking at all these border county regions. We're really pairing each border county with its cross border and sort of asking, do more people live in the low tax side or the high tax side? So a few sort of descriptive statistics here. But here's, we're going to do another sort of simple analysis where we just sort of create a graph of, we put these border counties in bins. So over here, this is the tax difference at the border. So over here, these are these are sort of across border counties where the difference at the border is effectively zero. The smallest 10% of border counties. Over here, we've got the largest 10% of border counties where the tax difference at the border is, about 6 percentage points in effective income. So this is what we're looking to see. So what do we expect? This isn't data. This is what we're sort of expecting. This is the pattern that we're looking for. And in these border counties where the tax difference is negligible, we shouldn't expect to see any real difference. We're expecting in the counties where the tax difference at the border is the largest, we're expecting people to be living on the lower tax side of the border based on our tax flight hypothesis. And what the real data that we see is actually, there's just not much of a pattern. In the technical analysis, it comes out as not statistically significant. And you can sort of visually read that. Again, just sort of looking at this sort of pattern we're looking for, what we actually see. There are, these are saying like in these places where the tax difference is biggest, there are indeed, fewer millionaires on the high tax side. More of them live on the low tax side. But it's just the pattern is just not really there. So coming to the title of the book, and giving sort of a partial conclusion here. Look, millionaire tax flight does sometimes occur. It's just that the magnitude is small, and really has little impact on the stock of millionaires in the state. Overwhelmingly, what drives the number of people in your millionaire tax bracket, should you pass it, or in a state's millionaire tax bracket, is really the income dynamics in the state. People becoming successful and growing into that tax bracket, people who've been longtime residents. And that's, migration is just a really tiny fraction of the tax bracket dynamics of how many people are in there, how much income there is to tax. So, at this point, you can imagine states setting tax rates extremely high. And then I think, these results of like some small effect today could eventually translate into large effects. But I think that on the whole, tax migration is sort of too small to matter for states today. Now, coming to some intuition about this, I just want to emphasize that, migration is a young person's game. And migration is really not about rich people. It's more about recent college graduates. And I think that that's something that every state should probably be paying more attention to. So I want to show you how this works. This is from the census. So we have 23 million Americans. These aren't millionaires per se. We're looking at migration rates by age. So we're going to look at life cycle migration and plot people with different education levels, starting with folks with low education, people who didn't graduate high school. They have low migration their whole lives. They start out with low migration and it stays low through their whole lives. Now, if you look at people who have high school or some college, the migration rates are a bit higher, only in the early years. Now you had college graduates, now we're starting to get very high migration rates, 12% a year. Remember, the millionaire migration rate was 2.4%. So college graduates are dramatically more mobile, like young college graduates are dramatically more mobile than millionaires. And they're just early career. They're figuring out where they're going to launch their career. And then we see people with a master's degree or higher having highest migration rates. But again, all of these migration rates are very quickly converging, I think quickly converging to the same low rates of migration that we see for basically everyone. So early career people are mobile, but late career, they are not. And that's a very strong pattern that we're seeing here. Now, so migration is a young person's game, but what isn't a young person's game is making a lot of money. Okay, so the median age of a top income earner is 49, 50 years old. The median age of an adult mover is about 30. So people are deciding where to live and where to set down roots about 2 decades before they hit their peak earnings phase. So, this is really important because, if we were trying to tax recent college graduates, there would be a lot more reason to worry because those folks are much more mobile. By the time people are in the top tax bracket, they're already past the age where they're thinking about moving around or want to start over in a new place. So, if you can use the revenues on the sort of late career working rich, the tax revenues generated from taxing the late career working rich, and use it to fund programs that enrich the lives and support the lives of young professionals, young folks starting families, launching their careers, this could be a very favorable policy in the end. Like there's a real logic to this because it in practice means that we're taxing the least mobile people. Okay, so just to conclude here, rich folks are really the wrong focus. Every state wants to have more rich people, but they're not very mobile. Future top income earners are mobile, and having a focus on attracting or realistically retaining people at the beginning of their career is a much more promising path, I think. And so how do we do that? I think it's about focusing on, well, the things that matter to people who are starting their careers and are starting a family, and quality of life, urban amenities, childcare, good schools, supports for young families in general, I think. And this can make it a positive sum, a sort of virtuous cycle if we're using these revenues to very effectively and productively invest in the kinds of things that matter to young families starting out. That helps you retain this pipeline, some of whom will become the top income earners 2, 3 decades later. And so, in this sense, we can sort of get an understanding of why New York and California been the centers of American capitalism for 100, despite taxing high income earners at high rates for the last 100 years, still the centers of American capitalism. So that's where I'll leave off. Yeah, and happy to take any questions you have.
Representative Higley.
So thank you, Missy, on your age migration chart, the 65-year and older. Any consideration, again, I'm thinking of Vermont in particular, but there's a lot of migration, if you ask me, to the warmer southern states. And I'm just wondering if that's calculated in any of that, not money-wise, but just to get out of the climate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I study migration by looking at people. And so the last graph I was showing you, it's an interesting puzzle when you look at the migration profile by age, because migration rates decline very relentlessly, and there's no spike in migration at retirement age, which is counterintuitive. And I think basically the reason is that, when retirees move, they're all moving to a couple of places, which is Florida and Arizona. And so you get these places that have a very high density of retirees, and you see them, or you read a story about these retirement communities, and you sort of think, wow, retirees are really mobile, and gosh, it makes sense. But it doesn't show up in like the census migration statistics. I think they just become quite most retirees don't move after retirement. The ones that do become salient because they're sort of clustered together in what become essentially very well known retirement communities. That's the best I've been able to sort of interpret it. But these are very simple census statistics that are completely sort of separate from any research on millionaire migration. The whole retirement question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm glad you ended with that last slide because it was mostly where can you attract someone who's going to be a potential earner of $1 million or more. Currently, we just don't have that industrial base to grow that many, whereas New York and California do. They have the industry there. So thinking about the relationship between, it's almost like an inelastic demand, you know, for income tax, if you will, versus elastic. They're not reacting because that's where you have to be to make the money. Would you say that that's right?
Yeah.
And I guess looking at your data, because it's looking at 1999 through 2011, and we've had so much mobile workforce since then where they can take the job anywhere. Do you think that if you updated the information with where people are now, that would change that perspective?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we have in the follow-up paper that just was published last year with IRS data, updated that to 2023 data. So we've got the Trump tax bill has happened since then, which affected, you know, the state and local the SALT cap. And that was a core part of the analysis in that. And finally, it didn't affect migration, the SALT cap. Also, we have the pandemic in there. We have the first 2.5, 3 years of the pandemic, first 3 years of the pandemic. And so we did see a lot of migration happen during the pandemic, a lot of migration of high income earners, a lot of migration of high income earners out of high tax states, but not out of low tax states. So a lot of this, I think, has to do with embeddedness and, you know, this sort of temporary period where, you know, where you lived wasn't as relevant for your job, especially if you're high income earner. You could, offices shut down, everybody went remote, the schools closed, the urban amenities closed, and what we saw as these are basically all the things that attach people to place. And what we saw that people who had means were moving. Now that was a very temporary thing, and so by 2023 we see that migration has returned back to normal, and people are sort of back to, you know, their regular life, and sort of tax migration has sort of dried up. So, you know, we have seen cases, we have seen a window in time, the pandemic era, where the things that basically tie people to place were really on hold, and then we saw people move. So, so there are interesting, you know, stories that come out of updating this. But, you know, I think still where we are left off by 2023 is, you know, the way things have been working for a long time. So, you know, particularly with remote workers, you know, that was a pretty temporary thing. Now, what you do see as still, I don't know how permanent it is, but still ongoing is, you know, part working, you know, part of the week from home, sort of partial work from home thing. So in the office 3 days a week, at working from home 2 days a week or vice versa, you know. And so what that means is like you can live a bit further. You know, if you lived in this New York City, you could live further out in the suburbs and the commute wouldn't be as painful. But it doesn't mean that now you could live in Florida or, you know, New Hampshire or something like this. So, you know, I guess you'd have to think about how that plays out exactly for Vermont. It's true that people have a longer commuting distance now. Other research has seen that, you know, move in the cities have seen this return to the suburbs to some degree, consistent with that, you know, just that migration to the commute to the office is not as painful because you're not doing it as many days a week. So we're seeing a little bit of that. And contrary to the trend that we've been seeing for a few decades, which was like a return to the city centers, you know. So how that's going to play out over the long term, I think people are still figuring out, but there has been that much of a pattern of it.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I have a question, but I'm not sure if it's for Dr. Young or whether it could be for somebody else that, you know, come talk to us, which is, if high income earners are sticky, how sticky is their income? So how much do tax changes sort of drive behavior around tax planning that we started to touch on, you know, when we were talking about trust law and all of that kind of stuff. So I can see, you know, high income earners staying put, but then perhaps using tax planning to move more of their income out of a state so that it's not taxed as heavily.
You know, great. I'm glad you're asking this because there are details of the Vermont proposal that I don't think are as understood as well. You know, specifically the investment income portion of of the tax proposal, that's a tax base that is not as well understood in general. I do think that the people who make most of their money from investments, they're a small portion of the millionaire set, but I think they are more mobile. And so that is a factor of concern. They don't have the office. They are probably older, so they're less likely to have kids at home, which is another thing that's very common among millionaire households. Families with kids don't want to move for the exact same, whether they make $1 million a year or $20,000 a year, they don't want to uproot their kids. So, folks that are making a lot of their money from investments have looked at this a bit. Yeah, they're a small fraction of the millionaires. They are probably a bit more mobile. They are potentially more sensitive to the tax rate. And specifically, more mechanisms, potentially more mechanisms. That income is not tied to the state. Let me just say that. So they could, your income, if you work as a top doctor in Vermont and you make, $1.5 million a year, or if you're like a corporate lawyer in Vermont and you're making a couple $1 million a year, you can't sort of pretend that you make that money anywhere else. If you move to New Hampshire, you would have to move your practice, because Vermont, I'm assuming, like every other state, virtually every other state, tax the money where it's made. But investment income doesn't, that logic doesn't apply to investment income. So it is easier to avoid, it is easier to take steps to avoid having Vermont be able to tax investment income, particularly if we're talking about capital gains income, stock market earnings. I think it's trickier to tax that, and it's easier to appear to move and avoid. So like I say in this example, the corporate lawyer has to actually move. They can't just sort of move their house to New Hampshire and say, oh, that's not Vermont money. It's still Vermont money for their practice, the earnings from their practice, but not the earnings from their investment. So it does give a stronger motivation to make that move. So I do think I would be happy to say that, this part that the Vermont bill is talking about, that investment, I think, there's more uncertainty around the implications of that. Raising the top marginal tax rate on general income is very similar to what 10 other states have done. And the country now has a lot of experience and a good way of judging what's the likely consequence of that, which is probably something, but quite small. The investment one is just, there's more unknowns.
Thank you. Ross? Thank you so very much for your time today and all the time you've given to the Vermont legislature over the last few years. I know you spent a bunch of time in the Senate earlier this session, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to help, yep. Feel free to follow up if you have any further questions.
We will. Thank you.
Take care.
Folks, we're about to wrap. I just wanted to let you know we had invited accountants to join us this week to talk about the bill. This is the week that most accountants take a vacation, so they're not available, but they'll try to join us next week. Someone from the trust company was not available, but we found a new person from the trust company of Vermont, and they are joining us later this week. And continuing, just please do let me know if there are witnesses that you want to hear from. Folks are submitting written testimony that's getting posted. And I'll see everyone tomorrow morning at 9. We are looking at a pilot law enforcement governance council. The reason it's here is because it's dependent on a county tax. We have a county tax system that we never talk about here ever. And so we'll have a primer on that from Tim Devlin, but just wanted folks to, I don't know, spend a microsecond preparing yourself for that. You can ask them.